In a recent post, we explored the mourning and burial rituals of first-century elite Israelites. This was to better understand how the evangelists, themselves literate elites, understood Jesus' resurrection, an event that would interrupt the ordinary mourning and burial process. What did the evangelist resurrection account say, therefore, about the death of Jesus? Was it something right and necessary, in other words, in accordance with God's will, or was it wrong, and thus overturned by God? We also learned that ancient Israelites believed that suffering in the flesh continued after death. Israelites believed that the process of decay was agonizingly painful for the dead person. The flesh was believed to contain all the sinful acts the deceased Israelite had committed through life. But once the flesh had melted away, so too had the shameful offenses against the honor of God. We also explored the widespread practice of asalegium, or the gathering of the bones, an essential final step in the Israelite mourning process. This was because it was widely believed that God would use the bones in giving resurrection to the deceased Israelite, for it was believed that the bones held the personality of the dead person. Without those bones, what is there to resurrect? Therefore, all Israelites would understand the horror if the corpse went missing. They would understand the terrible predicament of Mary Magdalene finding the tomb empty and the body of Jesus gone. But before we can truly understand Mary's predicament and the impact of experiencing the risen one, we need to consider a few more things. This is because Jesus was not an elite. Moreover, the peasant Jesus was condemned and executed. First, imagine a Judean elite person who was executed as a criminal. Under the law, the bones of the condemned had to be returned to his family, eventually. But this would not happen before 1 year following the execution. In the meantime, the Sanhedrin would take custody of the corpse. It would be placed into a special tomb maintained for this function. Was this supposed to happen to the executed Jesus taken down from the cross? Despite Jesus' peasant status, perhaps an echo of this was preserved in the Gospels, with accounts of elites like Joseph of Arimathea getting involved in the burial. The author we call John adds another ruler of the Judeans, Nicodemus. These are polished accounts, mind you. Could these story details be echoes of the Sanhedrin taking proper custody of the dead body of an elite condemned criminal? If so, over the decades between crucifixion and composition of the Gospels, things got polished by the Jesus groups. The original or historical purpose of Sanhedrin members taking possession of the corpse was not to honor the executed body. It certainly wasn't to provide peasant Jesus with enough embalming material as if he were a king being buried. In our United States cultural world, when lethal injection, electrocution, or other execution method gets employed, either professional physician or the medical examiner's office determines the exact point of death. Next, a coroner confirms this by signing a death certificate. Again, 21st century Western people understand death biomedically and occurring at an exact, unextended point in time. Culture shapes how we can and do perceive, think about, understand, and communicate reality, even death. Therefore, capital punishment, like death, was understood quite differently in the Mediterranean cultural world of first century Israelites than it is for 21st century United States people. Death for our ancient Israelite ancestors in the faith was far more involved than simply ending the life of the condemned person. In the biblical world, sentence of punishment lasted beyond physical death. Following the last breath of the condemned, all mourning for that person was suppressed. The dead corpse of the executed elite Israelite was imprisoned in a special tomb to languish through the agonizing yet purifying rotting process. He would decay, isolated and alone, without family mourning. The court oversaw the whole process, but once the flesh had all disintegrated, then the bones, now eligible for resurrection, would be returned to the family. Finally, the debt was paid, and the sentence carried out to the full. This, of course, reflects the fate of condemned and executed elites. But Galilean nothing person Jesus was not an elite. Nor was Jesus executed like most elites were. Rather, Jesus was crucified. So we should ask, what became of the corpses of crucified peasants? My friends, the answer is grim. You see, to be crucified in antiquity almost always was synonymous with being made food for scavengers, wild dogs, and birds. Again, don't think that what the elite enjoyed in life was the same as the plight of peasants. Don't think that when a regular elite Israelite died, the preparations that went into his burial were the same as what would happen to an Israelite Galilean peasant. And don't think that when an elite became a criminal and was executed, the aftermath was the same as when a peasant Galilean criminal was executed. And again, remember, the authors of the Gospels are elites. There is some evidence from Josephus and Philo that some crucified bodies were taken down from their crosses and buried, but these are exceptions that prove the rule of allowing the crucified dead to be eaten by animals. Once more, the Gospels were written by people belonging to 2% of the total population that could write, not Galilean peasants, nothing people. Things percolated and evolved through the decades. I should say now that it is official church teaching that Jesus was buried. Still, it makes one wonder, what an extraordinary thing it would have been for the crucified peasant Jesus to have actually been given burial. In any case, Richard Rohrbaugh and Bruce Molina inform us as to these cultural beliefs and practices which give us a contextual framework through which to understand the significance of gospel accounts of Jesus' burial. By this context, we should better understand what is being claimed by the first generations of Jesus groups concerning the resurrected Jesus. When we read the account given in the fourth gospel, Jesus is crucified by the Romans, but was condemned by the Judean populace, both the crowds and leaders together. According to the fourth gospel we call John, the body of Jesus was taken down from the cross and placed in custody by a high-ranking Judean, Joseph of Arimathea. Jesus' body was secured in a tomb in order to serve out the sentence of decay, so as to atone for its sins or dishonoring the God of Israel. Jesus' proper burial place in Nazareth was far away to the north, so this would be a horror element in the story, were it not for the fourth gospel's comedic irony. To suddenly find the tomb empty meant that the penal atonement process had been interrupted. In Johannine thought, Israel's chief priests and the entire Judean populace had judged that Jesus needed to rot away in atonement for his offenses, dishonoring the God of Israel, to prepare for resurrection. The understanding and proclamation that Jesus was raised means that the God of Israel has overturned the judgment of the Israelite people. Because there was no shameful sin in Jesus' flesh, according to the fourth gospel we call John, the God of Israel received Jesus into resurrection directly from his final breath. God overturned the death and decay sentence. Before the rotting occurred, God had intervened. That is how the Johannine Jesus group saw it anyway. For the fourth gospel to make the claim that Jesus was raised by God, that's passive voice, means that all the deeds and words of Jesus have been vindicated. Indeed, it could be no other way as far as the Johannine Jesus group was concerned. After all, according to the anti-society that wrote the fourth gospel, Jesus was the Word made flesh in Israel. How could God allow the Word of life to rot, to decay? Thus, God preserves the fleshly record of Jesus, the Word, complete and whole. My friends, there are major points of difference and disagreement between the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and the fourth Gospel we call John. The earliest followers of Jesus who experienced the risen one still had to contend with the shameful death of Jesus. They grappled with this. Looking at the greater tradition which undergirds all the New Testament documents, we find the earlier pre-gospel claim that Jesus was given resurrection by God. This was the cultural understanding of ancient Israel applied to Jesus. Seen culturally, to claim resurrection for Jesus is to assert that his death was wrong, not belonging to God's will. And thus, God, the highest of all judges, has overturned this wrong. Resurrection is the reward for the righteous, and the righteous should not be condemned. But according to the culturally specific theological perspectives found within many New Testament documents, in a certain sense, Jesus' death was right and necessary. Throughout its history, Israel had interpreted itself as suffering wrath, suffering vengeance from God, because they believed they had shamed God. That's what sin is in the Bible, to shame God, to dishonor God. Israel believed it had sinned against or shamed its patron deity. And God was being viewed in Mediterranean analogy to Mediterranean patrons. If a client sins against his Mediterranean patron, like in the Godfather movies, the patron calls out a hit on you to defend his honor. Ancient Israelites believed that it was evident that Israel had shamed God and that God was taking out vengeance on his own people because they had been humiliatingly dominated under foreign powers for 7 centuries. God must have allowed that. Indeed, the wrath hurled collectively at all Israel was served out as Romans crucified Israelites. God allowed that to happen, so the Israelite interpretation went, and in doing so, God took satisfaction in defending God's honor, shamed repeatedly by the Israelite people. But so manfully heroic were Jesus' sufferings on the cross, so unwavering was Jesus' undying loyalty, something extraordinary happened. God, seen as a Godfather-style Mediterranean patron and father, was so impressed by this Israelite male Jesus' honorable sufferings that he waived the honor debt owed him by Israelites. To all Israelites united to the Godfather-style loyalty of Jesus, the faith of Jesus, whom God had rewarded with resurrection. By raising the crucified Israelite peasant Jesus, establishing him cosmic Lord and Messiah, God was about to institute Israelite theocracy in the land of Israel, the kingdom of God. That's the gospel or innovation that Paul proclaimed decades prior to the composition of the Gospels. So we have here 2 interpretations of Jesus' death that we find in the New Testament. A cultural interpretation of Jesus' death, it is wrong, and a theological interpretation of Jesus' death. It is right and necessary. My friends, do you see how both of these interpretations clash? They contrast sharply. The theological interpretation has Jesus' death removing the shame of Israelite sin. So honored was God by Jesus' macho act that God waived his right to exact Mediterranean-style Godfather revenge on those who had dishonored God. When reading the Synoptic Gospels, please notice that both interpretations, the cultural, it's wrong, and the theological, it's right and necessary, are braided together as it were. Someone took both these contradictory traditions and artistically weaved them together in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, creatively blending them into one paradoxical story. They run smoothly in one narrative sequence. Hence, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus even predicts 3 times that he will die and be raised up. In contrast, the 4th Gospel called John rejects this juxtaposition completely. There is no paradox in John. There is no dissonance presented in the 4th Gospel between these 2 interpretations, cultural and theological. For according to John, the theological idea of Jesus' necessary redemptive suffering is completely abandoned. Only the cultural view remains. Jesus' death was wrong. Only that view was intelligible and definitive to the Johannine anti-society that wrote the fourth gospel. Why did Jesus have to die crucified according to the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke? It was because of some mixture of right and wrong. The right reason being the necessary act of a true Israelite honoring God in an ultimate way, thereby impressing God to change and waive his right to avenge his besmirched honor. Here, Jesus must die, and God desired this deliberately for the benefit of others. Please understand that this idea is a far cry from later Christian penal substitutionary atonement theories. But why did Jesus have to die crucified according to the fourth gospel, called John? Well, that's just it. According to the fourth gospel, he didn't have to die, except for the calamitous intransigence of the wicked and hopelessly blind Judeans. Regardless of this vile evil and stupidity, the God of Israel rescued and vindicated Jesus, the very mediator of life itself. Either the author we call John knows nothing, or rejects completely any idea that Jesus died deliberately due to God wanting him dead to benefit anyone. My friends, the problem for us, 21st century Western Christians, is that this subtle yet major difference between the Synoptic Gospels and John is almost impossible for Western believers to see. Our blindness here results from sitting on 2,000 years of theological and devotional freight. Our pietism has produced a continual blending of all the gospel accounts together, like a cake batter, through our Christmas and Holy Week observances, religious art, private devotions, and movies. Consequently, 21st century Westerners tend to read the synoptic understanding into John, where it doesn't belong. Later, we will counter the common objection and misunderstanding that by calling Jesus the Lamb of God, the fourth gospel does see Jesus' death as right and necessary.